Welcome back. In a moment, we'll continue our discussion on poaching, but first, here are some other stories to keep an eye on. The vice chairman of tech giant Samsung has been questioned as part of an investigation into the corruption scandal in South Korea. The firm is accused of making inappropriate donations to a confidant of President Park Geun-hye. Car manufacturer Volkswagen has been handed a $4.3 billion fine by authorities in the US. The German car maker pleaded guilty to 3 criminal charges related to rigging emissions tests. And the British Foreign Minister Boris Johnson and the UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres has joined UN-hosted talks on the future of Cyprus. Turkish and Greek representatives are said to be working towards a power-sharing arrangement for the island. The poaching of elephants for their ivory and tigers for their skins and bones is widespread, but it is of course illegal. It's led to extinction or reduced numbers of certain species. For example, the world has lost 97% of its tiger population in a little over a century. However, countless other animals are similarly overexploited. According to the International Union for the Conservation of Nature, the number of giraffes in the wild has declined by about 40% in the last 3 decades. This moves the species to the red list of vulnerable animals. Giraffes are mostly found in southern and eastern Africa, with smaller populations around the rest of the continent. In 1985, there were approximately 163,000 giraffes in the wild, but that number now stands at around 97,000, according to research carried out last year. Illegal hunting, the loss of natural habitats, and civil wars are among the reasons to be pushing the giraffe towards extinction. Well, still with me today, Charlie Mayhew from Tusk, the Conservation, Community Development and Environment Education charity working across Africa, and Glenn Davis from the Worldwide Fund for Nature. The giraffe, then, just another example of an animal that is under threat, not just from poaching, but there are a host of other factors as well. They need a particular kind of environment in which to survive, I'd imagine.
Absolutely. I think it's been called the sort of silent extinction that, so much attention is being rightly on the elephant and rhino and other sort of iconic species, but quietly the giraffe has been disappearing from this planet. And one of the big concerns and challenges for conservationists is actually the pressure on land and the loss of habitat that is, increasingly encroaching on.
Why is the habitat being lost?
Well, if just the population explosion in Africa, and the projection is that Africa's population is going to double by 2050. So the demand for land, for cultivation, for settlement, and everything else is just, constantly, pushing these species into smaller and smaller areas of land, and the poor old giraffe is one species that has
again
ranged over large areas.
How do you address a complicated issue like that? A family wants to grow some crops in order to survive.
So I think this is a fundamental backdrop that we need to bear in mind, that WWF's Living Planet report that just came out at the end of last year showed that since 1970, for the wildlife populations that have been monitored in that report, there's a 50% decline since 1970. So that's the backdrop. So the giraffe numbers are an indicator and an example of those substantial declines.
They're not alone, though. I mean, you've got loads of others, more than a dozen more on the critically endangered list on your website.
Yes. So that is the backdrop, and we have to be clear that there's urgency, and to take that message of urgency, we should not take it as giving up. Pandas last year were upgraded after fantastic work in China. We have a number of examples of where population have come up. Tiger numbers seem to be going up for the first time ever reported. So where we put the effort in, we can move it up. So to move to your question, how do we look at landscapes which allow human development, agriculture, conservation, looking after our water? This is the holistic one planet approach that we need for future development.
And that is the challenge which maybe hasn't been, or the strategy rather, hasn't really been adhered to. It's been done rather piecemeal. I mean, for instance, the Clintons have got a foundation, haven't they? They chuck a load of money at a project, but it might be rather narrowly focused. Are you saying these things actually need a broader focus?
We need both. We need to have excellent work on the ground. But unless you have the government policy, so agriculture policy, transport policy, which takes account of the multiple uses that society wants. Not, okay, well, we're just going to try and have as much palm oil as possible. Rather than, actually, we want a future where our children have palm oil and rainforests and orangutans in Southeast Asia. And it's keeping that broader vision for a green economy.
Well, it's twofold, I'd imagine. There must be an element of donor fatigue. Oh, another appeal about an animal in distress. But also, that might, I suppose, attract, because it's very simple. If you feel sorry for that animal, give some money. This kind of more granular, government-level, changing hearts and minds is pretty boring work, but it's got to be done, I guess.
It's absolutely essential, and you know, I think that we have to raise the awareness of the value of nature, and some of those values, you know, are sort of hidden, really.
Yeah.
You know, and so it's not it's engaging obviously at a government level, and you know, we have to recognise this in places like Africa. You know, conservation is pretty low down the priority list when they're sort of struggling with healthcare and education and infrastructure programs and things like that. But as Lynn said,
that is an accusation, isn't it? This is a preoccupation of the affluent West, and out of all kilter with actually rather more fundamental basics of life in Africa.
So I think that's a myth which fails to take account of the fact that people really appreciate, respect, and feel part of their national heritage. That this wildlife is part of who they are. It is hard to imagine China without pandas, for Chinese people, not for us. And I think that really taking that into account in economic development, rather than being just focused on let's make the cash, even in our own country, you know, we have done a national ecosystem assessment in the UK, and the Treasury accepts the importance of woodland areas for recreation, for human well-being, as well as nature.
Yeah.
So it's more complicated arguments, it's more complicated.
But they can
I don't
be
know if
won.
it's boring, but it can be one.
It can be one. Look, while we're debunking myths, I noticed that the report that came out today also challenges some of the headlines, which maybe news organisations and journalists are guilty of doing, which is to try and link, particularly perhaps in Africa, some of the chasing of money with international terrorism. Now, is that a factor in your understanding, really, that they are a new pressure being applied to this whole money chain?
Yeah, so I think it was the report's been very helpful in actually sort of dispelling, you know, some of the narrative that the illegal wildlife trade has been a driver of you know, armed rebel militia groups and sort of terrorism, and that's been probably overplayed a little bit. But what the report also does indicate is that, you know, where you've got conflict in the world, and particularly in Africa, is that it allows poaching and organized criminal syndicates to exploit that conflict and that insecurity. Right.
Where there's lawlessness, of course, poaching will rise. Yeah,
absolutely.
Yeah.
You know, there is, you know, there is some evidence that some groups may have been involved in some poaching in order to, but it's not been anything like the level that has possibly been reported in the last couple of years or so.
So we should resist headlines which sort of saying Al Qaeda or Daesh or anybody else are responsible for encouraging poaching as a means of raising funds for their
organisation. Well, I think that nevertheless, you know, the point is that you know, there is the drivers are insecurity, corruption, organised crime, you know, and it's so, you know, it's bad enough on that basis, let alone having to try and introduce the terrorism angle.
But the clarity we need is what? What do you think is the focus going forward for people, either concerned people in countries where these animals are not, or should be the focus of governments and territories where these animals are?
So I think an interesting thing that came out of the report launched today was where the military has conservation as one of its objectives, rather than militarizing conservation, that is an important element. You must have community buy-in. Wherever the communities are alienated, then lawlessness prevails. And we need to really look at the transport links to cut off the demand and look for where these illegal smuggling and trafficking is going on. And it's not just...
Is there some suggestions of how to do that? What's
Well,
best
I think
practice there? How do you disrupt the transport links?
Well, ports, airports and seaports, and trying to ensure that customs, law enforcement and intelligence gathering agencies are incorporating wildlife when they're looking for drug smuggling, when they're looking for arms smuggling. These are often the same organized groups. And the exit points, shipping points, are pinch points where you could focus. Of course, people will move, but we need to just have a focused look. And the final thing, of course, is if countries in Asia say, actually, we're not going to buy this, that will relieve the pressure all the way down.
And the market starts to disappear.
Well, you know,
and reduces the pressure.
Organised criminal networks, if the profit disappears, they will move on to something else.
Yeah. Gentlemen, thank you both. Glyn Davis, Charlie Mayhew, thank you both very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
We end our programme with the Insight Bite, a little something that we feel you should know. And today, it's a load of rubbish. Beirut's international airport could have its safety compromised by a large flock of birds that have settled nearby. The birds have been attracted by the Costa Brava dump, created last year to help combat the city's rubbish problem. Pilots have warned the birds pose a great threat to planes as they risk getting caught in engines. Activists have called for the closure of the dump, where the rubbish build-up is as high as 9 metres and still growing. And that's all for now. I'm Martin Stanford. That was Insight.